Hello and welcome to the Story of the Earliest Church, Part 1, Episode 3, Acts 5 and 6. So in Acts 5, we find out that the same God who has great mercy in Jesus Christ is still the same God who does judgment from the Old Testament. Sometimes you hear people say, well, God is the God who can fry you alive in the Old Testament, but he loves you in the New Testament. Well, the fact of the matter is, God can fry people alive in the New Testament too, and of course, he loves people in the Old Testament as well. Ananias and Sapphira. We end chapter 4 of Acts with Barnabas selling some excess property he has and giving it to those who are in need. And Ananias says, hey, he gets some real street credit for doing this. And I was going to do this business deal anyway. I'm reading between the lines here. So let's go ahead and sell this property. We'll give some of it to the church, and we'll look like we're all, we're holy and we're special. But then, we'll keep some of it back to ourselves. And his wife Sapphira apparently agreed with him. They do it. They bring the money to Peter. And Peter immediately discerns that he's keeping some back. And Peter's like, you know what? This was your money. You didn't have to give it. And yet you've decided to lie to the Holy Spirit. You're dead. And Ananias falls over dead. Now, his wife Sapphira is not there. And so when she gets there, Peter says, so how much did you sell this property for? And she says, well, so such and such, what my husband told me to tell you. And Peter says, you know what? The people who just carried your husband out are going to carry you too. And bam, she dies too. This is kind of a scary thing. But it's a reminder that God's character doesn't change between the Old and the New Testament. He is the same God of love, the same God of justice in both the Old and the New Testaments. Interesting things in the middle of chapter 5. People, even if they fall under the shadow of Peter, they can be healed. I think what's important to realize here is that God meets us where we're at. And so these people had faith. Is it that God said, I'm going to make it so that if they come even within the shadow of Peter, they can be healed? It's not so much Peter's shadow. It's the faith that these individuals had. And God, I'll take that currency, God said, the currency of your faith. Later on, Paul, he'll bless handkerchiefs, which, of course, many a televangelist has used ever since. But anyway, the last part of chapter 5, the Sadducees were very sad, you see. They don't believe in the afterlife. They get really upset again about this preaching of resurrection. And so they haul in the core disciples, and they basically put on their robes. They're all ready. Let's bring these people in so that we can tell them a thing or two. And of course, God has already freed them. They're back in the temple. And so when they're finally ready, okay, you can bring them to us. And they didn't have a British accent, or a bad British accent. But anyway, the people come and say, they're gone. Oh, I hear they're out preaching again in the temple, which is pretty funny if you ask me, and kind of embarrassing to the Sadducees and others. By the way, we learn from here that there is some association, it would seem, between the high priesthood and the Sadducean party. That's not to say that all high priests were Sadducees, but apparently some were. So they bring him in. They basically say, stop preaching in this name. And Peter, in a way that's reminiscent, actually, of Socrates in the Apology, he says, you tell us, should we obey God? Should we obey you, God? I think we'll obey God. Now, what's interesting, at the end of chapter 5, we meet a guy named Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel is a well-known Hillelite Pharisee. He's very famous. In fact, according to one tradition, he's the grandson of the great Hillel, founder of the school of Hillel. And the school of Hillel had a kind of God will do what God will do, que sera, sera, a little bit of a deterministic sense of things. The Hillelites were kind of like, and this is what Gamaliel does. Gamaliel says, you know what? If these men are of God, you can't stop them. If they aren't of God, God will stop them. And so let it go. And this convinces the Sanhedrin. Now, of course, if you believe in any kind of free will, it's not always that way. Gamaliel never becomes a Christian. We don't have to say his theology is inerrant. But in this case, he says the right thing. And of course, the right thing happens to the church. Well, chapter 6 is very interesting. In chapter 6, we have probably the first controversy in the early church. So we've gotten a real "we are the world" feel up to this point. Everybody's very unified. We are one in the bond of love. Kumbaya. That's kind of the feel we've had of the early church up to this point. But we do have a little problem when we hit chapter 6. And it's probably nobody's intentional fault. I hope it's nobody's intentional fault. But sometimes we sin unintentionally, right? We can wrong others without intending to do so. And so it appears that there is a problem with the distribution of food to widows. The Aramaic-speaking Jewish widows, they're getting their bread, but the Greek-speaking widows, Jewish, they're also Jewish, but they're Greek-speaking Jewish widows, apparently aren't getting their bread. It's like, here's a bread for you, here's a bread for you, here's a bread for you. Oh, we ran out again. Or maybe they didn't even notice that bread wasn't getting to the Greek-speaking widows. There's a kind of Aramaic privilege, Aramaic Christian privilege going on here, because the Aramaic-speaking widows are in the dominant group of the early church. Their widows are getting food. The Greek-speaking widows are not in the dominant group of the early church at this time. They're not getting food. And so whether it's intentional or not, it's a problem. And so Peter is called on this. He seems a little defensive to me. I've got to pray. I don't have time to wait tables. But God uses it. They set up 7 men to take care of the Greek-speaking widows. Although what we see them do is not take care of widows, right? What do we see them do? We immediately see Stephen preaching in the synagogue of the freedmen, and we see Philip, the evangelist, preaching to the Ethiopian eunuch in chapter 8, to the Samaritans in chapter 8. And so this wasn't just a material problem. This was a spiritual problem too. The Greek-speaking Jewish church did not have ministers, because the apostles, the disciples, they're all Aramaic speakers, you know. And so there's not just a bread deficit in the Greek-speaking Jewish widow world. There's a spiritual deficit, it would seem. And so God raises up leaders. This group of all of their names are Greek-speaking names. God raises up this group of leaders to bring the gospel. Philip the evangelist, he's called later on in the book of Acts, to bring the gospel to the Greek-speaking church. Chapter ends with Stephen getting in trouble. We have I get a feeling that Stephen was probably a little bit more in your face than Peter and John, or that the synagogue of the freedmen was a little bit more reactionary than the Sanhedrin. That's hard for me to believe. And so I have to think that maybe Stephen hit a nerve, and he's hauled in front of the Sanhedrin, and you probably know what happens next, but we will wait until next week to talk about it, or at least the next video to talk about it, because this is the story of the earliest church, part 1, episode 3, Acts 5 and 6.